The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Tucson like God's own fury as Mitch Armstrong rode into town, his weathered hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much death. The year was 1877, and the West was still wild enough that a man's gun spoke louder than his words most days. He hadn't planned to stop in this dust-blown settlement, but the sound of jeering voices drew his attention to a crowd gathered outside the general store. "Ain't no place for your kind here," a red-faced man shouted, his finger jabbing the air inches from a woman's face. She stood rigid, her chin raised despite the crowd circling her like vultures. "My money's as good as any man's," she replied, her voice steady though Mitch could see the tremble in her hands clutching a package to her chest. "Not when it comes from reading fortunes and peddling lies," another man chimed in. "We don't need no gypsy witch in Tucson." The woman, tall and straight-backed in a simple blue dress that had seen better days, met their stares without flinching. Her copper hair was pulled back severely from a face that might have been pretty if not for the wariness etched into every feature. "I sell remedies, not fortunes," she said, "and I've broken no laws." "You broke the law of decency," a woman in the crowd called out, and that brought a chorus of agreement and more insults. Mitch had seen enough. He'd ridden through half the territories watching people tear each other apart, and something in him had finally had enough. He dismounted in one fluid motion, the jingle of his spurs drawing a few glances as he approached. "Seems to me," he said, his voice carrying easily over the crowd, "that folks in these parts might have better things to do than harass a lady trying to conduct her business." The red-faced man turned, sizing up Mitch with narrowed eyes. "This ain't your concern, stranger." Mitch's mouth curved in what might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "Making it my concern." He stepped forward, dust rising around his worn boots, and extended his hand to the woman. "Madam," she hesitated, surprise evident in her green eyes before she placed her hand in his. Mitch turned to face the crowd, his other hand resting casually near his holster. "Now, I'd like to hear if anyone has something more to say." Silence fell. Mitch's reputation might not have preceded him to Tucson, but there was something in his stance and the cold assessment in his gaze that made even the boldest think twice. "Didn't think so," he said after a moment. He turned to the woman. "May I escort you to wherever you're headed, madam?" "Katherine Ross," she said quietly. "And yes, thank you." As they walked away, her hand still in his, Mitch could feel the stares boring into his back. It wouldn't be the last he heard of this, but for now the crowd dispersed, muttering among themselves. "You didn't have to do that," Katherine said when they were out of earshot, gently withdrawing her hand. "No, I didn't," Mitch agreed, "but neither did they." "They think I'm a witch," she said with a brittle laugh, "because I know which plants heal and which harm." "People fear what they don't understand," Mitch said. "And fear makes folks stupid and mean." She studied him as if trying to determine what his angle might be. "And what do you want in return for your gallantry, mister?" "Armstrong, Mitch Armstrong, and nothing," he said, tipping his hat. "Just passing through." "Nobody does something for nothing in this world, Mr. Armstrong," he shrugged. "Then consider it my good deed for the decade." That got a genuine smile from her, transforming her face. "Well, Mr. Armstrong, the least I can do is offer you a meal." "My home is just outside of town." Mitch hesitated. He'd planned to be moving on, putting miles between himself and the memories that had driven him west. But something about Katherine Ross, the dignity with which she'd faced that crowd, perhaps made him nod. "Lead the way, Miss Ross." Katherine's home was a small adobe structure nestled against a rocky outcropping about a mile from town. A modest vegetable garden stretched to one side, and herbs hung drying from the porch rafters. It was neat and well kept, though clearly the abode of someone with limited means. "It's not much," she said as she opened the door, "but it's mine." "It's more than most have," Mitch replied, removing his hat as he followed her inside. The interior was cool compared to the harsh heat outside. Simple furniture was arranged practically, but what caught Mitch's attention were the shelves lining one wall, filled with glass jars of all sizes containing dried plants, powders, and liquids. "Your remedies?" he asked, nodding toward them. "Yes." She set down her package on a small table. I learned from my grandmother. She was a healer back in Virginia before the war. Mitch moved closer to examine the collection. And that's why they call you a witch. That, and I'm a woman living alone who doesn't attend church regularly, she said dryly. It doesn't take much in these parts. How long have you been in Tucson? 6 months. She moved to a small stove and began preparing a simple meal, long enough to help some people, make others suspicious, and clearly outstay my welcome according to some. The ones you've helped don't stand up for you. Catherine's hands paused in their work. People have short memories when it comes to kindness, Mr. Armstrong, and longer ones when it comes to fear. As she spoke, Mitch noticed a small leather-bound book on her table, its edges worn from frequent handling. A Bible, he guessed, which made the accusations of witchcraft even more ridiculous. So what brings a lone cowboy to Tucson? She asked, changing the subject. You said you were passing through. I go where there's work, he said simply. Was heading to a ranch outside of town that's hiring. The Hartwell place, Mitch nodded. They're good people, she said. Fair employers from what I hear. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily as she prepared a meal of beans, cornbread, and dried fruit. Mitch found himself telling her about the last few months riding with a cattle drive from Texas, while she shared stories about some of the more unusual remedies she'd concocted. This is the best meal I've had in weeks, Mitch said honestly as they ate. Trail food gets mighty tiresome. It's simple fare, but I appreciate the compliment. Her smile was warmer now, the wariness partially faded from her eyes after they finished eating. Mitch knew he should take his leave, but found himself reluctant. There was something about Katherine Ross that intrigued him, her resilience, perhaps, or the intelligence that shone in her eyes when she spoke of her healing work. I should get going, he said finally, rising from his chair. Thank you for the meal. Thank you for your intervention in town, she replied, walking him to the door. Though I fear it may make things worse in the long run. How so? Now they'll say I've bewitched you as well. Her tone was light, but her eyes were serious. Let them talk, Mitch said. I've been called worse than bewitched. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back. Miss Ross, if you have any more trouble in town. I can handle myself, Mr. Armstrong, she said firmly. I've been doing so for quite some time. I don't doubt it. But sometimes an extra gun doesn't hurt. He placed his hat back on his head. I'll be at the Hartwell Ranch if you need anything. She nodded, though they both knew it was unlikely she would call on him. Safe travels, Mr. Armstrong. Mitch rode toward the Hartwell Ranch with the taste of Catherine's cornbread still on his lips and the image of her proud stance before that hostile crowd burned in his mind. He'd meant what he said. He was just passing through. He always was. But something about Tucson, or perhaps someone in it, made him wonder if this time might be different. The Hartwell Ranch sprawled across several hundred acres of decent grazing land. John Hartwell, a burly man with a booming voice and an impressive mustache, hired Mitch on the spot after a brief conversation that established Mitch knew his way around horses and cattle. Bunkhouse is over yonder, Hartwell said, gesturing toward a long, low building. We run about 20 men here, most decent sorts. Pays fair, food's good, and I don't tolerate troublemakers. Suits me fine, Mitch replied. I'm not looking for trouble. Good, because we've had enough of that lately with cattle rustlers hitting the smaller spreads in the area. Mitch nodded, filing that information away. When do I start? Dawn tomorrow. Get yourself settled in. The other ranch hands were indeed a decent bunch, mostly. A few eyed Mitch with the natural suspicion reserved for newcomers, but most were welcoming enough, eager for fresh stories and news from other territories. It was during the evening meal that Mitch heard Catherine's name mentioned. That Ross woman fixed up my shoulder good as new, one of the older hands, Frank, was saying. Couldn't lift my arm above my head for months after that fall, and the doctor in town said I'd have to live with it. She's a witch, another hand, Pearson, muttered. Everyone knows it. Frank scoffed. She's no more a witch than you are, just knows her business with them herbs and such. My ma was the same way back in Kentucky. She live out there all alone, don't she? A younger hand asked. No husband or family. Husband died in the war from what I heard, Frank said. She keeps to herself mostly. Smart woman, another hand commented. Town folk don't take kindly to her kind. And what kind is that? Mitch asked, speaking up for the first time. The men looked at him, seeming to remember his presence. Frank answered, independent, I reckon. Too smart for her own good, some might say. I ran into her in town today, Mitch said casually. Seemed like she was catching some grief. Ain't surprised, Frank said. Sheriff Tanner's wife has been spreading tales. Says Miss Ross gave her a remedy that made her sick, but I'd wager Mrs. Tanner just didn't follow instructions proper. Woman's known to be particular about doing things her own way. Mitch absorbed this information silently. The politics of small towns were always the same: alliances, grudges, and power plays disguised as moral concerns. You sweet on her already, Armstrong? Pearson asked with a sly grin. Been in town less than a day. Just curious, Mitch replied evenly. Always good to know who's who when you're new in town. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Mitch's thoughts remained on Katherine Ross. A widow living alone, using skills passed down through generations to heal others and receiving fear and suspicion in return. It was an old story, one he'd seen played out in different variations across the frontier. The next few days were filled with the hard work of ranch life. Mitch fell easily into the routine, grateful for the physical demands that left little time for thinking. He was good with horses, better than most, and Hartwell quickly assigned him to work with some of the more difficult animals in the remuda. It was on his first day off that Mitch rode back into Tucson. He told himself he needed supplies, which was true enough, but he found himself looking for a glimpse of copper hair as he rode down the dusty main street. He didn't see Katherine, but he did overhear conversations that concerned her as he went about his business. In the general store, the proprietor and a customer were discussing her openly. Sheriff says if there's one more complaint, he'll have to take action, the customer was saying. Can't have someone peddling dangerous concoctions. Seems to me her remedies work more often than not, the proprietor replied cautiously. My rheumatism ain't bothered me since I started using that salve she made. That's how she hooks you in, the customer insisted. Then before you know it, you're under her spell. Mitch finished his purchases without comment, but a familiar anger was building in his chest. He'd seen this kind of ignorance before, had watched it destroy lives. Before leaving town, he made his way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tanner was a thin man with watchful eyes and a perpetually pinched expression. He looked up from his desk as Mitch entered, his gaze assessing. Help you? He asked. Mitch Armstrong. I'm working over at Hartwell's, Mitch introduced himself. Thought I'd stop by, make myself known. Appreciate the courtesy, Tanner said, though his expression suggested otherwise. You planning to stay long in these parts? For a while, Mitch replied. It's good work. Tanner nodded. Hartwell runs a clean operation. Keep your nose clean while you're there and we'll get along just fine. That's my intention. Mitch leaned against the doorframe. Heard there might be some trouble brewing with a healer woman outside of town. Tanner's expression hardened. Miss Ross is no concern of yours, Armstrong. Just curious, saw her catching some grief the other day when I rode in. Seemed like a lot of fuss over some herbal remedies. What goes on in my town is my business, Tanner said coldly, and I suggest you focus on your ranch work rather than sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Mitch straightened, tipping his hat. Just making conversation, Sheriff. Good day to you. As he left the sheriff's office, Mitch's concern deepened. Tanner's defensiveness suggested something personal in his attitude toward Katherine. Remembering what Frank had said about the sheriff's wife, Mitch wondered just how far Tanner might go to please her or to make an example of a woman who didn't fit neatly into what the town considered respectable. Acting on impulse, Mitch turned his horse toward the road leading out of town, following the path to Katherine's adobe home. He told himself he was just checking on her, ensuring there hadn't been any trouble since their last meeting. It was what any decent person would do. Katherine was in her garden when he approached, kneeling among rows of plants with a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, one hand instinctively moving to her skirt pocket where Mitch suspected she kept some means of protection. Recognition softened her features as he dismounted. "Mr. Armstrong, this is unexpected. Miss Ross," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I was in town for supplies and thought I'd see how you were faring." She stood, brushing soil from her hands. "Very well, thank you." "No more incidents in town, if that's your concern." "Good to hear." He gestured to her garden. "Impressive crop you've got growing. It serves my purposes." She studied him curiously. "You found work at the Hartwell Ranch." "I did. Good outfit." An awkward silence fell between them. Mitch realized he hadn't thought beyond his impulse to check on her, hadn't planned what to say once he confirmed she was all right. "Would you like some water?" she offered finally. "It's a hot day for social calls." "Much obliged," he said, following her to the house. Inside, Katherine poured water from a ceramic pitcher into 2 cups. "So, Mr. Armstrong, what really brings you out here?" "I doubt it was concern for my gardening abilities." Mitch smiled at her directness. "I heard some talk in town. The sheriff seems to have taken a particular interest in your activities." Katherine's expression closed. "Sheriff Tanner and I have an understanding. I stay out of his way and he mostly stays out of mine. His wife has been spreading stories about your remedies." "Agatha Tanner wouldn't follow simple instructions," Katherine said with a sigh. "I told her 3 drops of the tincture in water twice daily. She took the entire bottle at once, convinced more would work faster." She shook her head. "It made her violently ill, of course, and naturally that was my fault rather than her impatience." "And the sheriff's taking her side. Wouldn't you take your wife's side?" She gave him a measured look. "Besides, Agatha Tanner is Judge Wilson's daughter. Her opinion carries weight in this town." Mitch leaned against the table. "Sounds like dangerous enemies to have." "I didn't come west looking for an easy life, Mr. Armstrong." She took a sip of water. "Neither did you, I imagine." "No," he agreed, "but I didn't come looking for unnecessary trouble either." "Are you suggesting I should leave?" There was an edge to her voice now. "Not at all, just offering my assistance if you need it." "And why would you do that? You barely know me." It was a fair question, one Mitch had asked himself on the ride over. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when good people stand by and do nothing in the face of ignorance and fear." Katherine studied him for a long moment. "You've lost someone to it," she said softly, her perception unsettling him. Mitch didn't answer directly. "I'm at the Hartwell Ranch if you need anything. They say we might be in for some trouble with rustlers, so we're keeping extra watches, but someone can always get word to me." She nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Armstrong, truly, but I've been taking care of myself for a long time now." "I don't doubt it," he said, finishing his water and setting down the cup. "But everyone needs help sometimes." As he prepared to leave, Katherine walked him to his horse. "You know," she said, "you never did tell me why you stood up for me that day in town. You could have just ridden on by like everyone else." Mitch considered her question as he adjusted his saddle. "My mother taught me to step in when I see someone being treated unfairly," he said finally. "She'd have had my hide if I'd ridden past." She sounds like a formidable woman. "She was," Mitch said, mounting his horse. "Good day, Miss Ross." As he rode back toward the Hartwell Ranch, Mitch wondered at his continued interest in Katherine Ross. He'd meant what he said about his mother's teachings, but there was more to it than that. Something about Katherine's quiet dignity, her determination to live on her own terms despite the cost, resonated with him in ways he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of ranch work. The threatened rustler activity materialized, with 2 small neighboring ranches losing cattle. Hartwell doubled the night watches, and Mitch found himself spending long, quiet hours under star-filled skies, rifle across his lap, watching for movement in the darkness. It was during one such watch that Frank, who was paired with him that night, brought up Katherine again. "Heard there was trouble at the Ross place yesterday," he said casually as they sat by a small fire. "Someone poisoned her well." Mitch's head snapped up. "What?" "Yep. Rode by there on my way back from town. She was hauling water from the creek. Said someone had dumped something in her well, oil or tar, something to foul it." "Was she hurt?" "Nah, she's too smart for that. Said she could smell something wasn't right before she drank any." Frank poked at the fire. "Offered to help her clean it out, but she said she'd manage." Mitch felt a cold anger settling in his chest. Anyone take responsibility? Course not, Frank scoffed. Cowards work that. But word is Mrs. Tanner's been saying that woman's a menace that needs to be run out of town before she hurts someone else. And the sheriff claims his hands are tied unless Miss Ross can prove who did it. Frank spat into the fire. Convenient, ain't it? Mitch was silent for a long while, his mind working. You think Hartwell would mind if I took a day to help her clean that well? Water's not something you can do without out here. Frank gave him a knowing look. Reckon he'd understand. Man's got a sense of right and wrong, Hartwell does. That's why he still trades with Miss Ross for her remedies, despite what the town folks say. The next morning, after their watch ended, Mitch approached Hartwell about taking a day to help Katherine. The rancher studied him for a moment before nodding. Fair enough, he said. Frank told me what happened. Not right, fouling a person's water. Take whatever supplies you need. Mitch rode to Katherine's place with tools, rope, and a determination to set things right. He found her outside, attempting to lower a bucket into the well and bring up the contaminated water for disposal. She straightened as he approached, surprise evident on her face. Mr. Armstrong, Miss Ross, he greeted her, dismounting, heard you had some trouble with your well. A shadow crossed her face. News travels fast. Frank mentioned it. I've come to help clean it out. She hesitated, and Mitch could see the struggle between pride and practicality playing out in her expression. Finally, practicality won. I would appreciate the assistance, she said. It's slow work alone. Together, they set about the laborious task of cleaning the well. Someone had indeed poured what looked like a mixture of tar and oil down it, fouling the water. It took hours of hauling up buckets of the contaminated liquid and scrubbing the stone walls of the well as far down as they could reach. As they worked, conversation flowed more easily between them. Katherine told him about growing up in Virginia, about losing her husband at Antietam, and about her journey west seeking a fresh start. I thought people out here would be more accepting, she said as they took a brief rest, drinking from the water Mitch had brought with him. Less bound by convention. Some are, Mitch said, but fear and ignorance travel west same as people do. What about you? She asked. What brought you to the territories? Mitch was quiet for a moment. Restlessness mostly. After the war, couldn't seem to settle anywhere. You fought. For the Union, yes. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. By late afternoon, they had removed most of the contamination. The well would need time to refill with clean water, but the worst of the damage had been repaired. I can't thank you enough, Katherine said as they put away the tools. It would have taken me days on my own. Happy to help, Mitch replied, looking at her closely. In the fading light, with wisps of copper hair escaping her practical bun and a smudge of dirt on her cheek, she looked both vulnerable and indomitable. You should report this to the sheriff. She gave a bitter laugh. And what would that accomplish? He'll say there's no proof of who did it, and the only result will be more resentment toward me for causing trouble. It's not right, Mitch said, frustration evident in his voice. No, it's not, she agreed softly. But it's the way of things, for now at least. As Mitch prepared to leave, Katherine placed a hand on his arm. Stay for supper, she said. It's the least I can do after all your help. The invitation surprised him, but he found himself nodding. I'd like that. Inside her small home, Katherine prepared a simple but satisfying meal. As they ate, Mitch found himself watching her hands, capable, strong hands that knew how to heal, how to grow things, how to survive. You're staring, Mr. Armstrong, she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Mitch, he corrected her, and I apologize. Mitch then, she said, testing the name, and I'm Katherine to my friends. Are we friends, Katherine? He asked quietly. She considered the question. I think perhaps we are. You've certainly acted like one, which is more than I can say for most in these parts. After the meal, as Mitch reluctantly prepared to return to the ranch, Katherine pressed a small jar into his hands. For your trouble, she said, it's good for sore muscles. I imagine ranch work provides plenty of those. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Mitch felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. From Katherine's momentary widening of eyes, he suspected she felt it too. Thank you, he said, tucking the jar carefully into his saddlebag. If there's any more trouble, I'll be fine, she assured him. But thank you. Riding back to the ranch under a sky ablaze with stars, Mitch reflected on the day. Katherine Ross was getting under his skin in a way no woman had in years. Her courage, her intelligence, her quiet dignity in the face of persecution, all of it drew him to her like a moth to flame, and that, he knew, could be dangerous for both of them. The next few days passed without incident. Mitch threw himself into his work, trying not to think about copper hair and green eyes and hands that could both heal and captivate. The ranch hands noticed his distraction, but, apart from some good-natured ribbing from Frank, left him to his thoughts. It was during a supply run to town that Mitch next encountered trouble. He was loading purchases into his saddlebags when he overheard a conversation from inside the general store that made his blood run cold. "Sheriff says we can't legally run her out without cause," a man was saying, "but if there was to be a fire, say, and her place was to burn down, well, that would be a real shame." "Accidents happen all the time out here," another voice agreed, "especially to those who aren't wanted." Mitch stepped back inside the store, his hand instinctively moving to rest near his holster. Two men, one he recognized as Pearson from the ranch, the other a townsman he didn't know, stood near the counter, unaware of his presence. "That sounds an awful lot like planning arson," Mitch said, his voice cutting through the murmured conversation. Both men turned, Pearson's face registering shock before smoothing into a sneer. "Eavesdropping, Armstrong." "Hard not to hear when you're plotting a crime in public," Mitch replied evenly. "Miss Ross has done nothing to deserve having her home burned down. That witch has been causing trouble since she arrived," the townsman said. "Poisoned Sheriff Tanner's wife, she did." "That's not what happened," Mitch said, "and you know it." Pearson stepped closer, his hand drifting toward his own gun. "You sweet on her, Armstrong, been bewitched by those green eyes." "I just don't hold with threatening women," Mitch said. "Especially ones who have done nothing wrong except live their lives on their own terms." "You'd best mind your own business," the townsman warned. "Unless you want to find yourself unwelcome in Tucson as well," Mitch smiled coldly. "I've been unwelcome in better towns than this one." He turned to Pearson. "Hartwell knows you're planning this?" A flicker of unease crossed Pearson's face. "Hartwell don't need to know everything his hands do off the ranch. I imagine he'd be real interested to hear one of his men is planning arson. You threatening me, Armstrong?" "Just stating facts," Mitch said. "Stay away from Katherine Ross, both of you." The tension in the store was thick enough to cut with a knife. The shopkeeper had disappeared into a back room, clearly wanting no part of the confrontation. "You can't watch her place day and night," the townsman said. "Accidents happen when least expected." Mitch's patience snapped. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man by his shirt front and slammed him against the nearest wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "If anything happens to Miss Ross or her property, I will hold you personally responsible, and trust me when I say you don't want that." "Take your hands off him," Pearson demanded, drawing his gun. "I wouldn't," Mitch advised, not taking his eyes off the choking townsman. "Because even if you manage to shoot me, which I doubt, my dying act will be to put a bullet through your friend's head here." Pearson hesitated, and in that moment of indecision, the door to the store opened again. Sheriff Tanner stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with narrowed eyes. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Mitch released the townsman, who slumped against the wall, gasping. "Just a difference of opinion, Sheriff," he said calmly. "He threatened us," Pearson said quickly. "Pulled a gun on Jenkins here." Tanner's gaze moved to Mitch's holster where his gun remained secured. "That's so?" "No," Mitch said, "but I did overhear these two planning to burn down Katherine Ross's home." Tanner's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Armstrong." "It's also the truth." "He's lying," Jenkins sputtered, having regained his breath. "We were just talking about how dangerous it is out there with her practicing her witchcraft." Tanner looked between the three men, clearly weighing his options. "Armstrong, I suggest you finish your business in town and head back to the ranch. Jenkins, Pearson, I'll have a word with you." Mitch held the sheriff's gaze for a long moment before nodding. "I'll do that, but my warning stands. As he left the store, he could feel Tanner's eyes on his back. The sheriff might not like Katherine, might even be allowing his wife to spread lies about her, but Mitch doubted he wanted an actual crime committed in his jurisdiction. Still, he couldn't be sure Tanner would do anything to stop Pearson and Jenkins. Instead of returning to the ranch, Mitch rode straight to Katherine's place. He found her hanging herbs to dry on her porch, looking peaceful and unaware of the threat looming over her. "Twice in 1 week," she said as he approached, a smile lighting her face before she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" Mitch dismounted quickly. "I overheard some men in town planning to burn your place down." The color drained from Katherine's face. "Who?" "Pearson from the ranch and a townsman named Jenkins." He stepped closer. "The sheriff knows, but I don't trust him to handle it." "You need to be careful, Katherine." She nodded slowly, her gaze moving to the vulnerable wooden portions of her home. "I suspected something like this might happen eventually." "Pack some things," Mitch said decisively. "You can stay at the ranch tonight." "Hartwell's a fair man, he won't turn you away." "I can't leave," she protested. "My garden, my remedies, everything I've built is here." "It won't do you any good if you're dead," Mitch said bluntly. "Please, Katherine, just for a night or two until I can be sure they won't go through with it." She hesitated, clearly torn. "You realize this will only confirm their beliefs, that I've bewitched you into protecting me." "Let them think what they want," Mitch said. "I know the truth." After a moment, Katherine nodded. "Give me a few minutes to gather some essentials." While she packed, Mitch checked around the property, making sure there was no one watching from the surrounding hills. The isolation that had likely appealed to Katherine when she settled here now seemed dangerous, too far from town for help to arrive quickly if needed. When she emerged with a small bag, Mitch was struck by the determination in her face. This was a woman who had faced loss and hardship before, who had rebuilt her life from ashes once already. He silently vowed she wouldn't have to do so again. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," she replied, securing her home as best she could before allowing Mitch to help her mount behind him. The ride to the ranch was tense, both of them scanning the landscape for any sign of threat. Katherine's arms were wrapped around Mitch's waist, her body warm against his back. Under different circumstances, he might have appreciated the closeness more. John Hartwell was in the yard when they arrived, his eyebrows rising at the sight of Katherine. "Trouble?" he asked simply as Mitch helped Katherine dismount. "Yes," Mitch said, and briefly explained what he'd overheard. Hartwell's face darkened with anger. "Pearson's fired. No man who works for me threatens women." He turned to Katherine. "Miss Ross, you're welcome to stay as long as needed. My wife will be pleased for the female company." Relief washed over Mitch. "Thank you, sir." "No thanks needed for doing what's right," Hartwell said gruffly. "Now let's get Miss Ross settled. Martha," he called toward the main house. "We have a guest." Martha Hartwell was a practical, no-nonsense woman who took one look at Katherine's pale face and immediately ushered her inside, promising hot food and a safe place to rest. Mitch watched them go, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "You did right bringing her here," Hartwell said, reading his expression. "But you know this won't solve the problem." "No," Mitch agreed, "but it buys us time." "Pearson will be back from town soon," Hartwell said. "I'll deal with him then. You keep an eye out for any others who might have similar ideas." True to his word, when Pearson returned to the ranch later that afternoon, Hartwell confronted him publicly in the yard. The other hands gathered to watch as the rancher dressed down the cowboy in terms that left no doubt about his feelings on the matter. "I don't employ men who threaten to burn women out of their homes," Hartwell concluded, his voice carrying across the yard. "Get your things and get off my property by sundown," Pearson's face contorted with rage. "You're taking the word of a newcomer over a man who's worked for you for 2 years. Because of some witch, I'm making a judgment based on character," Hartwell replied evenly. "Armstrong's shown more in a few weeks than you have in 2 years, and Miss Ross has never been anything but helpful to this ranch, providing remedies when our people needed them." "You'll regret this," Pearson spat, his gaze finding Mitch in the crowd of onlookers. "You both will." As Pearson stormed off toward the bunkhouse to collect his belongings, the other hands dispersed, murmuring among themselves. Frank approached Mitch, shaking his head. "Always knew Pearson was a mean one," he said. "Good riddance." Mitch nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles weren't over. Men like Pearson didn't take humiliation well, and he had allies in town, including Jenkins. That evening, Katherine joined the Hartwells and Mitch for dinner in the main house. She had regained some of her color and composure, though Mitch could still see the worry in her eyes. "I can't thank you enough for your hospitality," she said to the Hartwells. "I hope my presence won't cause problems for your ranch." "Nonsense," Martha Hartwell said firmly. "This ranch stands for decency, and there's nothing decent about threatening a woman living peacefully on her own land. Besides," Hartwell added, "you've helped enough of my men with your remedies. Consider this repayment." The conversation turned to lighter topics, but Mitch noticed Katherine's gaze often drifting toward the windows, as if expecting to see flames on the horizon. After dinner, as Martha showed Katherine to the guest room, Hartwell pulled Mitch aside. "Pearson's gone, but he made some threats on his way out," he said quietly. "Said he wasn't finished with either of you. I've posted extra guards tonight, but be careful." "I will," Mitch promised, "and thank you again for taking her in." Hartwell studied him for a moment. "You care for her?" It wasn't a question, but Mitch answered anyway. "Yes, thought as much." Hartwell clapped him on the shoulder. "She's a good woman, strong, the kind that makes a man better just by being around her." Mitch couldn't disagree with that assessment. In the short time he'd known Katherine, she'd awakened something in him he thought had died years ago, a desire to put down roots, to build something lasting. The night passed without incident, but Mitch slept poorly, waking at every sound. By dawn, he was already up and checking the perimeter of the ranch, looking for any sign of Pearson or his allies. He found Katherine on the porch of the main house, watching the sunrise. She wore the same dress as yesterday, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he hadn't seen before. The sight of it, copper strands catching the early light, made his breath catch. "You're up early," he said, joining her. "I didn't sleep much," she admitted. "Too worried about my home." "I was thinking we could ride out there later, check on things," Mitch suggested, "if you want to." She nodded gratefully. "I'd like that. I need to tend the garden anyway, if it's still there." "It will be," Mitch assured her, though he couldn't be certain. "Hartwell's given me the day to escort you." They set out after breakfast, Mitch riding alert with his rifle across his saddle. The journey was quiet, both of them tense with anticipation of what they might find. As they crested the final hill, Katherine's small adobe home came into view, still standing and apparently untouched. She let out a breath of relief. "Thank God," she murmured. But as they rode closer, Mitch noticed something wasn't right. The front door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Stay here," he said, drawing his gun. "No," Katherine replied firmly. "It's my home." Together, they approached cautiously. The interior of the house had been ransacked, furniture overturned, Katherine's precious jars of remedies smashed on the floor, their contents mixing in puddles of glass and liquid. Katherine made a small, wounded sound as she surveyed the destruction. "Why?" she whispered. "What possible purpose did this serve?" Mitch had no answer for her. This was pure malice, designed to hurt and intimidate. He moved through the small home, checking for any remaining threat, but whoever had done this was long gone. Outside, Katherine's garden had been trampled, plants uprooted and scattered. The well appeared untouched, at least, but the damage to her livelihood was extensive. "Katherine," Mitch said gently, finding her standing amid the ruins of her remedies. "I'm so sorry." She looked up at him, and he was struck by the fire in her eyes rather than the tears he had expected. "They think this will drive me away," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They're wrong." "It's not safe for you here," Mitch argued, "not alone." "Then I won't be alone," she said simply. "I'll hire help, build fences, get a dog." She bent to pick up a partially intact jar. "I won't be driven from my home, Mitch, not again." He understood then that this was about more than just the current threat. Katherine had already lost one home, one life, to forces beyond her control. She wouldn't surrender another without a fight. "Then let me help you rebuild," he said. She looked at him in surprise. "You have a job at the ranch." Hartwell will understand. Besides, it won't take long to set things right with two of us working. Katherine studied him for a long moment. Why are you doing this, Mitch? Really? It was a question he'd been asking himself since that first day in town. The answer, when it came, was simpler than he'd expected. Because you deserve better than this, he said. Because you've faced down fear and ignorance with courage that humbles me, and because— he hesitated, then decided truth was called for. Because I care about what happens to you, Katherine, more than I expected to. Something softened in her expression. I care about you too, she admitted quietly, though God knows it's probably unwise for both of us. They began cleaning up the mess, salvaging what could be saved and taking inventory of what needed to be replaced. As they worked side by side, Mitch found himself watching Katherine, the determined set of her jaw, the careful way she handled even broken fragments of her precious remedies, the occasional flash of humor that surfaced despite the circumstances. By midday, they had made progress on the interior of the house. Katherine was sweeping up the last of the glass when the sound of approaching horses made them both tense. Mitch moved to the window, hand on his gun, and relaxed slightly when he recognized Frank and two other ranch hands from Hartwell's. Boss sent us to help, Frank called as they dismounted. Figured you might need some extra hands. Relief washed over Mitch. Appreciate it, he called back, stepping outside to meet them. The men had brought lumber, tools, and supplies for repairs. With their help, the work progressed much faster. By evening, the house was secure again, though Katherine's remedies and garden would take much longer to restore. As the ranch hands prepared to return, Frank took Mitch aside. Hartwell says you can stay here tonight if needed. He's doubled the watches at the ranch in case Pearson tries anything there. Thanks, Mitch said. I think I should stay just to be safe. Frank nodded knowingly, figured as much. We'll come back tomorrow to help with the garden. After they left, Katherine prepared a simple meal from the supplies the ranch hands had brought. They ate in companionable silence, both exhausted from the day's work. You should take the bed, Mitch said as they finished eating. I'll sleep out here. Katherine looked like she might argue, but then nodded. Thank you for everything today. No need for thanks, Mitch said. It's what friends do. Is that what we are? She asked softly. Friends, Mitch met her gaze across the table. For now, he said, his meaning clear, if that's what you want. A flush rose in her cheeks. I think perhaps I want more than friendship, Mitch Armstrong. In time, the admission hung between them, fragile and hopeful. Mitch wanted nothing more than to close the distance between them, to taste the lips that had just spoken words he'd longed to hear. But he held himself in check, knowing that haste could ruin what was growing between them. Then we have time, he said simply. Katherine's smile was worth every moment of restraint. The next days fell into a pattern. Mitch divided his time between ranch work and helping Katherine rebuild. The garden was replanted, the well secured with a locked cover, and the house reinforced with better locks and shutters. Frank and other friendly hands from the ranch stopped by regularly, their presence a clear message that Katherine had allies. In town, tensions remained high. Sheriff Tanner made a cursory investigation into the vandalism at Katherine's home, but predictably, found no conclusive evidence of who was responsible. Pearson had disappeared, reportedly heading south toward Nogales, but Jenkins remained in town, watching with barely concealed hostility whenever Katherine ventured in for supplies. It was during one such trip, nearly 2 weeks after the vandalism, that matters came to a head. Mitch had accompanied Katherine to town, both of them aware of the stares and whispers that followed them down the street. They were at the general store, purchasing seeds to replace those destroyed in the garden, when Jenkins entered with 2 other men Mitch didn't recognize. Well, look who it is, Jenkins said loudly. The witch and her guard dog. Mitch turned slowly, positioning himself between Katherine and the men. We're just here for supplies, Jenkins, no need for trouble. You brought the trouble when you stuck your nose where it don't belong, one of the other men said. This town was peaceful before you two started stirring things up. I've lived here 6 months without causing anyone harm, Katherine said, stepping up beside Mitch despite his attempt to keep her behind him. I sell remedies that heal. If that's witchcraft to you, then perhaps you should reconsider your definition. My wife took your remedy and was sick for days, Jenkins snapped. Your wife didn't follow instructions, Katherine replied evenly. As I explained at the time, calling my wife a liar now, Jenkins moved forward threateningly. That's far enough, Mitch said, his hand moving to his gun. The atmosphere in the store was charged with tension. The shopkeeper had disappeared again, and the only other customer, an elderly woman, pressed herself against the far wall. 3 against 1, Armstrong, the third man said, grinning unpleasantly. Those ain't good odds. Depends on the one, Mitch replied, his voice cold. The standoff might have escalated further if not for the timely arrival of John Hartwell, who strode into the store with the confidence of a man used to command. Gentlemen, he said, taking in the scene with a quick glance. Is there a problem here? Jenkins hesitated, clearly unwilling to challenge one of the most influential ranchers in the area. No problem, Hartwell, just having a conversation. Sounded more like threats to me, Hartwell said mildly. And I take a dim view of 3 men threatening a woman in one of my hands. The witch has you fooled too, one of the men muttered. Hartwell's expression hardened. Miss Ross has been nothing but an asset to this community, providing healing where the nearest doctor is 2 days' ride away. I suggest you consider that before you continue this foolishness. The backing of someone with Hartwell's standing clearly gave the men pause. After a tense moment, Jenkins jerked his head toward the door. Let's go, he said to his companions. Ain't worth the trouble. As they left, Jenkins turned back with a final glare. This ain't over, he warned. When they were gone, Katherine let out a shaky breath. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. Don't mention it, Hartwell said, though I think it might be wise for you two to finish your business and head back. Tempers are running high. They followed his advice, completing their purchases quickly and mounting up for the return journey. As they rode, Mitch couldn't shake the feeling that Jenkins's parting words were more than just an empty threat. They won't give up, will they? Katherine asked as they neared her home. Some might, Mitch said honestly. Once they see you're not going anywhere, others will need more convincing, she finished for him. I've faced worse, Mitch. During the war, I saw what men are capable of when driven by fear and hatred. So have I, he said quietly. That's what worries me. At her home, they unloaded the supplies in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As Katherine began sorting the seeds for planting, Mitch made a decision. I'm going to stay here tonight, he said. After what happened in town, I don't trust Jenkins to leave it alone. Katherine looked up at him, something unreadable in her expression. I won't argue, she said finally, but this can't go on indefinitely, Mitch. You can't divide yourself between the ranch and here forever. No, he agreed. But I can for as long as it takes to ensure you're safe. She set down the seeds and moved closer to him. And then what? The question hung between them, laden with possibility. Mitch reached out, gently tucking a strand of copper hair behind her ear. Then, he said softly, we figure out what comes next, together, if that's what you want. It is, she whispered, and the certainty in her voice made his heart race. This time, Mitch didn't hold back. He leaned in, closing the distance between them, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion that had been building since that first day in town. Katherine responded with equal fervor, her hands coming up to frame his face as she pressed closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mitch rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since I first saw you standing up to that crowd, he admitted. Katherine laughed softly. And I've wanted you to since you took my hand and dared them all to speak. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, many of them moving fast. Mitch tensed, pulling away reluctantly and moving to the window. Riders coming, he said, his hand moving to his gun. At least 5, maybe more. Katherine paled but stood straight. Jenkins. Can't tell yet, Mitch said, straining to see in the fading light. But I don't like the speed they're coming at. As the riders drew closer, Mitch's heart sank. In the lead was Sheriff Tanner with Jenkins and several other townsmen behind him. None of them looked friendly. Stay inside, Mitch told Katherine, moving toward the door. No, she said firmly, following him. This is my home, I'll face them with you. They stepped onto the porch just as the riders reined to a stop in the yard. Sheriff Tanner dismounted first, his expression grim. "Miss Ross," he said, tipping his hat with cold formality. "Armstrong, Sheriff," Mitch acknowledged. "What brings you and half the town out here? Official business," Tanner said. "There's been a complaint filed against Miss Ross for practicing medicine without a license." "That's ridiculous," Katherine said. "I sell herbal remedies, not medical services." According to statements from several citizens, including Mrs. Jenkins here, Tanner continued, gesturing to a sour-faced woman among the riders, "you've been diagnosing illnesses and prescribing treatments. That constitutes practicing medicine. This is harassment and you know it," Mitch said, anger building in his chest. "Mind your tone, Armstrong," Tanner warned. "I'm here in an official capacity." "What exactly do you want, Sheriff?" Katherine asked, her voice steadier than Mitch would have expected given the circumstances. "You have two choices," Tanner said. "You can cease selling your remedies and remain in the territory, or you can leave Tucson and its surroundings within 3 days. And if I do neither?" Katherine challenged, "Then I'll have no choice but to arrest you for violating territorial law." Mitch stepped forward. "You have no grounds for this, Tanner, and you know it." "I have signed statements from respected citizens," Tanner countered. "That's all the grounds I need." The standoff was interrupted by the sound of more approaching riders. All heads turned to see John Hartwell leading a group of his ranch hands, including Frank, toward the house. "What's all this, Sheriff?" Hartwell called as they approached. "Official business, Hartwell," Tanner replied, though Mitch noticed a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Miss Ross is being served notice for practicing medicine without a license." Hartwell dismounted, striding forward to join Mitch and Katherine on the porch. "Is that so? And who's making these accusations?" "Several citizens have signed statements," Tanner repeated. "Citizens like Jenkins here, whose wife didn't follow simple instructions and blamed Miss Ross for her own foolishness?" Hartwell asked, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Or perhaps Mrs. Tanner, who did the same," the sheriff's face hardened. "Watch your words, Hartwell." "I'm simply stating facts," Hartwell replied calmly, "as is my right as a citizen of this territory." The tension in the yard was palpable. Jenkins and his companions looked increasingly uneasy as more of Hartwell's men arrived, shifting the balance of power. "This doesn't concern you, Hartwell," Jenkins said. "It's between the law and the witch." "That's where you're wrong," Hartwell said. "Miss Ross has provided valuable services to my ranch and my people. Her remedies have healed injuries and illnesses that would otherwise have required days of travel to reach a doctor." He turned to Tanner. "I suspect Judge Wilson might be interested to hear how his son-in-law is harassing a respected healer at the behest of a few disgruntled citizens." Mitch saw Tanner's expression shift at the mention of the judge. Clearly, Hartwell had hit a nerve. "Furthermore," Hartwell continued, "I've sent for Dr. Wells from Bisbee. He should arrive within the week to assess Miss Ross's remedies and provide his professional opinion on whether they constitute medical practice or simply traditional healing arts, which, as you know, are not regulated under territorial law." This was news to Mitch, and from Katherine's surprised intake of breath to her as well. Hartwell had evidently been making arrangements behind the scenes. Tanner hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, he said, "Until the doctor's assessment, Miss Ross is to cease selling any remedies." "That seems reasonable," Hartwell agreed before Katherine could protest. "For a short period only, of course." The standoff ended with an uneasy truce. Tanner and his posse departed, though not without Jenkins throwing a final venomous glare toward the porch. When they were gone, Katherine turned to Hartwell. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," Hartwell said. "I meant what I said about your value to this community. Besides, my wife would have my hide if I let them run you off. Your salve is the only thing that eases her arthritis." As Hartwell and his men departed, promising to keep an eye on the road for any returning trouble, Mitch and Katherine were left alone once more. "You have powerful friends," Mitch observed. "It seems I do," she agreed, looking thoughtful. "Though I'm not sure what Dr. Wells will say about my remedies." If he's any kind of decent doctor, he'll recognize their value, Mitch assured her. And if not, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Katherine looked at him curiously. We, Mitch took her hand. Yes, we. If you'll have me. Her answer was to rise on tiptoe and press her lips to his, a gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. True to her word, Katherine ceased selling her remedies, though she continued tending her rebuilt garden and organizing her supplies. Mitch divided his time between the ranch and her home, unwilling to leave her alone for long despite the regular patrols Hartwell had arranged. Dr. Richard Wells arrived from Bisbee on a sunny afternoon 4 days later. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a scholarly air that immediately put Katherine at ease. "Miss Ross," he greeted her warmly, accepting her offer of water after his long journey. "I've heard quite a bit about you from Hartwell. All good, I hope," she said, casting a nervous glance at Mitch, who stood nearby. "Indeed," Wells smiled. "He speaks highly of your healing abilities. I must admit, I'm intrigued." Formal medical training often overlooks the wisdom of traditional remedies. His open-minded approach was unexpected and refreshing. Over the next several hours, Dr. Wells examined Katherine's collection of remedies, asking detailed questions about ingredients, preparations, and applications. He took meticulous notes and even requested samples of several preparations. "I'm particularly interested in your treatment for arthritis," he said as they concluded their discussion. "The combination of herbs you've selected has scientific merit, though most of my colleagues would be loath to admit it." "And your assessment, Doctor?" Mitch asked the question that had been hanging over them. "Is Katherine practicing medicine illegally?" Wells closed his notebook thoughtfully. "In my professional opinion, Miss Ross is practicing traditional healing arts, not medicine as defined by territorial law. Her remedies are herbal preparations, not pharmaceutical compounds, and she makes no claim to cure diseases beyond the scope of such treatments." Relief washed over Katherine's face. "Will you testify to that if needed?" "I'll do better than that," Wells said. "I'm preparing a paper on traditional healing methods for a medical journal. With your permission, I'd like to include your remedies as examples of effective traditional treatments still in use on the frontier." "Of course," Katherine agreed readily. "Furthermore," Wells continued, "I'd like to propose a collaboration. There are many ailments common in these territories that respond poorly to conventional treatments. Your knowledge of local plants and traditional remedies could prove invaluable." The meeting with Dr. Wells marked a turning point. His official letter, stating that Katherine's activities did not constitute practicing medicine without a license, was delivered to Sheriff Tanner the following day. While Tanner accepted the ruling with poor grace, he had no choice but to drop the matter. Jenkins and his allies were less easily dissuaded. Though they ceased their open harassment, Katherine occasionally found dead animals left on her property or heard hostile whispers when she ventured into town. But with Hartwell's continued support and Dr. Wells's professional endorsement, the worst of the persecution gradually subsided. As summer gave way to fall, Mitch found himself spending more time at Katherine's home than at the ranch bunkhouse. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, evolving from tentative kisses to a profound connection that neither had expected to find. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Mitch took Katherine's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, "a dangerous pastime," she teased, leaning against his shoulder. "Hartwell's offered me a position as foreman," he continued. "His current man is retiring come spring." Katherine straightened, looking at him with surprise. "Mitch, that's wonderful, you've earned it." "It means I'd be staying in Tucson," he said. Permanently, understanding dawned in her eyes. "I see." "The thing is," Mitch went on, suddenly nervous despite having rehearsed this moment countless times in his head, "I don't much like the idea of riding back and forth between the ranch and here indefinitely." "Oh." Her voice was carefully neutral. Mitch turned to face her fully. "Katherine Ross, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. You face down prejudice and hatred with courage that humbles me. You heal with your hands and your heart." He took a deep breath. "I love you, and if you'll have me, I'd like to make this arrangement permanent." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Mitch Armstrong? I'm asking if you'll marry me," he said simply. "Be my wife. Let me build a life with you here or wherever you want to go." Katherine's answer was to throw her arms around his neck, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that left no doubt about her feelings. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Hartwell Ranch. Martha Hartwell had insisted on hosting, declaring that Katherine deserved a proper wedding surrounded by friends. Dr. Wells stood as witness, along with Frank and several other ranch hands who had become allies over the months. Sheriff Tanner and most of the townspeople were conspicuously absent, but Katherine found she didn't mind. The people who mattered were their people who had seen her for who she truly was and stood by her when it counted. As she and Mitch exchanged vows under the vast Arizona sky, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the loss of her first husband and her home in Virginia, through the long journey west seeking a new beginning, to the persecution she had faced in Tucson, each step, painful as some had been, had led her to Mitch. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the traveling preacher declared, and Mitch pulled her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and protection. The celebration afterward was joyous, with food and music and dancing lasting well into the night. As the festivities wound down, Mitch led Katherine away from the gathering toward a small cabin at the edge of the Hartwell property. "What's this?" she asked as they approached. "Wedding gift from Hartwell," Mitch explained, opening the door to reveal a cozy interior, simply but comfortably furnished. "For us to use until we decide where we want to settle permanently." "It's perfect," Katherine said, stepping inside. "Though I admit I've grown attached to my little adobe home." "Then we'll make it ours," Mitch promised. "Add on rooms as needed, build a proper fence, maybe expand the garden." "As needed," Katherine repeated, a smile playing at her lips. Mitch grinned, pulling her close. "Well, Mrs. Armstrong, I was thinking a family might need more space than a single woman." "Mrs. Armstrong," she said, testing the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Mitch murmured, lowering his mouth to hers. Later, as they lay entwined in the cabin's bed, Katherine shared her dreams for their future: a larger garden with more medicinal plants, perhaps an arrangement with Dr. Wells to provide remedies for his patients. Maybe even a proper clinic someday where she could teach others her healing arts. Mitch listened, offering suggestions and support, his heart full with the knowledge that after years of wandering, he had finally found his home not in a place, but in the woman beside him. "You know," he said as she finished outlining her plans, "that first day in town when I saw you standing up to that crowd, I never imagined we'd end up here." "No." Katherine propped herself up on one elbow, smiling down at him. "What did you imagine, honestly?" Mitch brushed a strand of copper hair from her face. "I just knew I couldn't ride past without doing something. The rest." He shrugged. "The rest was unexpected, the best kind of unexpected. For me too," she admitted. "Though I was certain you were either crazy or looking for payment of some kind when you took my hand that day." Mitch laughed. "Well, I got payment, just not the kind anyone would have expected." "And what kind is that?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. "I found love," he said simply. "After thinking I never would again." Katherine's expression softened. "So did I." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Mitch thought about the journey that had brought them together: a chance encounter in a dusty town, a moment of courage that had changed both their lives forever. He had ridden into Tucson with no plans to stay, a drifter passing through like so many times before. Instead, he had found the one thing he never expected: a love worth fighting for, worth staying for. Outside, the desert night wrapped around their cabin like a protective blanket, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Arizona sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. No doubt there were still those in town who resented Katherine and her foreign ways, but together, they would face whatever came. For Katherine, wrapped in the safety of her husband's arms, the future stretched before them bright with possibility. She had survived loss and persecution, had built a life from nothing not once but twice. Now, with Mitch beside her, she would build again not just a home or a healing practice, but a family, a legacy of love and courage that would outlast the prejudice they had faced. In the years that followed, Tucson slowly changed. New settlers arrived, bringing different perspectives. Dr. Wells's paper on traditional healing methods, featuring Katherine's remedies, was published to acclaim in medical journals back east, lending scientific credibility to her work. Even Sheriff Tanner, after his wife's rheumatism was finally relieved by one of Katherine's salves, administered in secret and with much reluctance, softened his stance. Katherine and Mitch expanded her small adobe home, adding rooms as their family grew to include first a son, then twin daughters. The garden became renowned throughout the territory, drawing visitors seeking healing and knowledge. Katherine trained apprentices in her methods, ensuring the traditional knowledge would not be lost. Mitch served as Hartwell's foreman for many years before eventually purchasing land adjoining Katherine's original property, where they raised horses as well as children. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming known for both its fine horses and the healing remedies still produced in the expanded workshop beside their home. On warm evenings, they would often sit on their porch, watching the sunset just as they had that day Mitch proposed. Sometimes they spoke of the past of the day a lone cowboy rode into town as a woman was mocked, took her hand, and dared them all to speak. More often, they spoke of the future of their children's prospects, of new remedies Katherine was developing, of the changing territory around them. But always, beneath the words, lay the certainty that had sustained them through every challenge. That in each other they had found a love worth fighting for, a partnership built on respect and admiration, and a home where both could be fully themselves. And in the end, that was the greatest healing of all.